Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Matthew Linton. I'm the Publications and Communications Manager here at the Council of Graduate Schools. I'd like to welcome you all to a webinar on microcredentials and the future of graduate education. This features presentations by Wojtek Hodgko-Zyko from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, Julie Masterson from Missouri State University, and Holly Zanville from Credential As You Go. Just a couple of webinar logistics here to get us started. So we encourage you to please submit questions at any time through the Q&A feature in your Zoom toolbar. However, we will only be answering audience questions during the designated Q&A period, which will follow today's presentations. A reminder that the recording and presentation slides will be emailed to registrants as well as posted to the CGS website after the live event. So our plan for today is that we're going to have 3 speakers who will speak for approximately 40 minutes total, followed by audience Q&A. The 3 presenters in order will be Holly Zanville, research professor at George Washington University and co-lead of Credential As You Go. Then Wojtek Hodgko-Zyko, Dean of the Graduate College at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And Julie Masterson, Associate Provost and Dean of the Graduate College at Missouri State University. And they will discuss the landscape of post-baccalaureate microcredentialing and how these credentials operate as part of a portfolio of graduate education options. These presentations will be followed by a hybrid roundtable and audience Q&A. And now I'd like to turn the presentation over to CGS President Suzanne Ortega. Suzanne?
Thanks, Matt. And good day, colleagues. We're so glad that you could join us today for a discussion of this very important topic. I know you know that microcredentials are a growing part of higher education landscape. What you may not know is just how dynamic a landscape it is. According to a recent Credential Engine report, and I still can't believe the numbers, there are over 350,000 unique degrees and certificates provided by American post-secondary institutions and 967,734 unique credentials. So it's no surprise at all that it's challenging, not only for us as administrators, but for our students to navigate such a complex and fast-moving marketplace. Fortunately, we have 3 speakers who are going to help us unravel some of the nuances and to help us think through and explore core questions around credential transparency and quality. I'm really delighted that in support of a better understanding of the microcredential landscape, CGS has just recently embarked on a new project entitled Exploring the Complementary Roles of Graduate Level Non-Degree Certificates and Master's Degrees in the Reskilling and Upskilling of the Post-COVID Workforce. This project is made possible with generous support from the Educational Testing Service, and it will really help us understand the relationship, complementarity, and adjacency of certificates and master's degrees, and really with a focus on understanding how each in parallel or as the most recent SHRM report seems to suggest, often in combination, actually help to support entrance into and pathways into the global workforce. So keep an eye out for more information on this project. And I really look forward to hearing from the wisdom of our panelists. Holly, you're up first.
Hi everybody, and I'm looking to share my screen now. And my toolbar has disappeared. Okay, share screen. Man, I'm having a problem seeing my screen. There we go. Are you able to see this now?
Yes, I can see it.
Oh, great. All right. We said we thought nothing would go wrong, but you never know on Technology Day. So thanks, Suzanne, and congratulations for the new grant. It's so timely. I'm really pleased to be with you today to share some thoughts on micro-credentials, the big picture for students, institutions, and employers. And to start, I've identified some hot topics, and this is not letting me move my slides. Thank you. I've identified some hot topics around micro-credentials. First, some of the big trends: increasing calls for transparency in all credentials, the rapid growth of many types of micro-credentials, the call to use common or translatable language to describe credentials, and establishing linked data networks so that we can better understand our credentialing systems. A second one, employer views of micro-credentials. A third, embedding industry certifications, badges, and non-credit certificates into traditional degree programs. Fourth, growing concerns about the quality and value of these credentials, especially by states who have to decide which programs to support with public funds, and by accreditors who are considering their role in short-term or micro-credential systems that are in development. A fifth one, international developments. And sixth, the growing number of major initiatives that are working in the micro-credentialing space. And if there are trends, there are drivers. And Matt, it looks like you're going to have to drive the slides. Thanks. There are drivers of these. And some of the key drivers are our data degree-centric system that's hindering many learners in education and employment, equity, confusion and chaos that's impacting navigation in the marketplace, the lack of data on the value of credentials, questions about the value of degrees at all levels. Do they signify the skills that employers need, and are they aligned with changing workplace needs? The naming dilemmas and data dilemmas. And I'm going to touch a little bit on some of these. So if you'd change the slide. So a first driver is the view of many that our tiered 4-degree system, 200 years old, is dated, and it no longer is adequate to meet 21st century workforce needs and the equity needs of our nation. Partial degrees are not recognized. Too often students are treated as if they have no learning when they leave their college university without completing a degree. And degree lengths are insurmountable for many students, and this is particularly an issue for many of the graduate programs. So one solution is to transform our degree-centric post-secondary system to a credential-as-you-go approach, and this brings micro-credentialing to the fore. I actually think that one of the best ways to start a micro-credentialing discussion is with the students. So if you go to the next slide, I'm going to share with you a few graphics. This graphic was drawn just a couple of months ago to capture what we think will be growing calls by students to credential all their valuable learning from multiple sources, including short-term credentials. And this next one was drawn 5 years ago, but it's still unfortunately relevant. It's credential poker. Students trying to determine which set of credentials constitute the best hand. And then there's the naming dilemmas. What do we call a short-term credential that is not a degree? A micro-credential, a micro-pathway, non-degree credentials, a certificate. There are an increasing number of synonyms for micro-credentials, and this is really adding tremendous confusion to the marketplace. If you haven't seen this report, and this is the report that Suzanne just mentioned, it's the Credential Engine. It's turning into be an annual report, which tries to describe the landscape of the U.S. credentialing system. And to use their words, today's credentialing landscape is vast and growing, and our system is confusing and inefficient. So here's the nearly 1 million unique credentials in the U.S. alone. And I would mention that one of the reasons why the numbers they might be inflated, depends on how you view degrees. All biology programs in the US are viewed as separate. And then you could argue that they really should somehow be counted as one type of credential, but they're counted as separate because the institutions by and large indicate that their programs are very unique. So this is a problem in the data, that just something to know about. But in this report, they identify 16 credential categories across 4 types of credential providers: the post-secondary institutions, the MOOC providers, the non-academic providers, and secondary schools. And our last cartoon, what is the value of our various credentials, especially in combo packages, which is really getting to be more the norm for those institutions that are working more in the micro-credentialing space. Well, this is some of the context, in the micro-credentialing world. And many are calling, given the drivers and the trends that are before us, are calling for an incremental credentialing system. And this is where micro-credentialing fits in. So what are incremental credentials? They are really trying to capture learning as it is acquired along the learning pathway and formally recognize and connect that learning to a larger context. They can be non-credit or credit bearing, undergraduate or graduate level, any size, from small units of learning through degrees. And maybe we'll, in the question and answer, we can talk more about credential as you go. So I want to turn next to employers, because they're a very key driver in changes in our system. And I've identified 4 research efforts that I think would be really helpful for you to know about if you don't, and because they're focusing on employer behavior. What do employers do when presented with a micro-credential or with a combo of credentials, which is actually more likely the situation? And given the time limits, I'm just going to touch on one of these, but you'll have the slides. So if you want to learn more about each of these other ones, you'll be able to go back to that later on. So the one that I want to talk about is making sense of micro-credentials, which is research conducted in Ontario, Canada, a couple of years ago. They surveyed 200 employers, 2,000 working age Canadians, and 160 representatives from more than 100 post-secondary institutions on their experiences, awareness, and perceptions of micro-credentials. And if you go to the definition they came up with, they actually created a definition of micro-credentials. It's kind of a broad statement that was informed by international examples, and many nations are developing their own definitions for micro-credentials. And interesting to note, they're not all identical. Well, here are some of Ontario's main findings. Only 1/4 of the general population of Canadians surveyed had actually heard of micro-credentials, and only 19% could provide some kind of a definition. Most of the colleges and universities in the survey were either already offering micro-credentials. Please don't turn to that one yet. We'll stay on the definition one. But most of those already offering micro-credentials indicated they're doing so as standalone credentials, 89% of them as standalones, or as part of corporate training, 73%. And keep in mind that these are all colleges, so they would include their equivalent of community colleges and universities. And some are offering stackable micro-credentials that can be combined, 39% of them. Most of the higher ed institutions in the survey indicated they're seeing micro-credentials as a way of accessing a new market of students. And interesting to, I think, this group, 83% reported that their institutional leadership is encouraging the development of micro-credentials, though less than 40% of them claim to have a framework or a strategy to help guide them in this micro-credentialing work. The Ontario survey asked employers how they would react to seeing a micro-credential on the application of a job candidate. 60% of them said a micro-credential would increase their confidence in a potential employee's skills. About 2/3 said they would see a micro-credential as highly favorable if it was directly related to the job at hand, or if it was competency-based, or if it was, I'm turning my pages here, which I'm not wanting to turn. Or if it was accredited. So for those of you who want to look a little more closely at the Canadian Employer Survey, you'll have the slides so you can see the data, but let's go to the next one, because there's 4 charts that they posted, which I think are very interesting, and it provide a good example of what's being looked at in micro-credentialing research. So the first question they asked employers was, what is your level of awareness or experience with the various types of micro-credentials that might appear on a candidate's resumes? And these included things like verified certificate, digital badge, master track certificate, micro degree, micro masters, nano degree, etc. So you can see all the different terms that are at play in the field. So the next question that went to employers on the next slide was, what's the importance of the credential issuer attributes in signaling quality? And again, they included a pretty interesting array of variables, like the validation by industry and evidence of alignment with employer needs, evidence with previous hires and performance results, the general reputation and brand of the institution, transparency and granularity in terms of companies and outcomes, third-party assessment of quality or accreditation. So again, these are pretty interesting findings from the employers. So the third question that they asked was, how familiar are you with the following terms for short, flexible credentials? And here they use variables like competency-based education, micro-credential, digital badges, stackable credentials, alternatives, and you can see the list here. And then the fourth question they asked employers was, imagine that you came across a micro-credential in the application of a candidate. How favorably would you consider the following features of that micro-credential? And they looked at things like directly related to the job applied for, whether or not it's competency-based, accredited, industry aligned, awarded by a Canadian college university, standardized, and you can scan down the list yourself. So the last part of this, the work in Ontario really speaks to quality issues on the next slide. And the Canadian group identified 6 quality markers, things that higher education should be transparent about and consider incorporating in their micro-credential offerings, that they be relevant, that they be accredited, that they be standardized, assessed, flexible, and stackable. And they, given the governmental structures in Canada, they can put out a criteria like this, and the institutions may pick them up. That's a little different than our very decentralized system in the US, but I thought you would be interested in looking at their idea of quality markers. So this is some of the context related to students, employers, and institutions within our very dynamic, confusing, and rapidly changing credentialing system, especially related to micro-credentials. So what I did next to close is to look forward. And I came up with my top 11 projections going forward for today anyway, and apologies that I'm running through this so quickly. But the first, I think, is growing recognition that many micro-credentials like badges and certifications are critical in our learner work ecosystem, contrary to the view by many that their add-ons are just nice to-dos. Micro-credentials will become more important, particularly in certain industry sectors. So growth is going to be uneven. Many graduates, employees, and employers will not be interested in obtaining more formal credentials, rather be focused on skill domain development and certification. Navigating the system is going to be more confusing, especially for students and employers. More efforts to embed micro-credentials into degree and certificate programs are going to be developed. There's going to be more growth in micro-credentialing by providers outside higher ed, adding to the confusion. And with that range of broader providers, there will be growing questions around quality and value, and the accreditors are going to be paying more attention to and reassessing the review approaches. This is already happening. Some of you may have seen the HLC report that they recently issued for their board about whether or not their accreditation reviews should start including non-degree or micro-credentials in addition to degrees and certificates as part of the review of the institution's curriculum. The next one is more growth at the graduate level. We can talk about that later. We have a little bit of data about that. More R&D on who's impacted and affected by micro-credentialing, especially by low income, race, ethnicity, gender, and age. Growing pressure to digitize all valuable learning onto learner education and employment records that will be portable and earned over a learner's lifetime. There's a tremendous amount of development nationwide in this concept, and that developments will be global, not US only. So what I did, since I rushed through this pretty quickly, on the next slide, I provided you a few references. If sorry, that slide is out. To go to the next one. Yeah, I provided a few recommended readings, and when I share the updated slides with Matt, there will be one other recommended reading that I added to the list. So thanks again for letting me join the discussion today, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what you all have going on at your institutions.
Thanks so much, Holly. Wojtek?
Yeah, well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for the invitation. You know, as I was reflecting on micro-credentials and other non-traditional programs at the University of Illinois, I think they fall into a a subset of actions we're taking to transform higher education in response to significant societal changes. So, I think that all of us recognize that the fast-paced digital transformation of industry, of societal systems, and our daily lives are creating a need for change in education. So I think all of us would agree that our nation needs a future-ready, diverse workforce that is able to create economic growth and prosperity in many of the ways that Holly just mentioned. I think that this need for transformation has really been captured very well in a great book by Art Levine and Scott Van Pelt, The Great Upheaval. And some of you may have read the work that they write about 5 new realities. And I want to just mention these because these have been tremendously influential in directing our thinking at the University of Illinois. So reality number 1, increased competition. New content producers and distributors will enter the marketplace, challenging the long-standing monopoly of universities and colleges, driving up competition and consumer choice while driving down prices. Reality number 2, consumer choice. The power of higher education consumers will increase, giving them more options with respect to what, where, when, and how they learn. And I think we've become used in higher education to thinking of the people who make those calls for our students, but that is rapidly changing. The third new reality is students are demanding that we embrace technology that provides them with access to personalized learning experiences in a way that works best for them and not necessarily for us. So I'm sure that many of us have heard from students that they want asynchronous access to information. They might not particularly want to come to a lecture at this point in time. And we're realizing that we're going to have to respond to some of those wishes and desires of the new student population. With respect to learning outcome, the knowledge economy will increase emphasis on learning outcomes and de-emphasize traditional education metrics such as time-bound degrees and on-campus programs. So employers want to know what their potential employees can do and what they know, and they're becoming a little bit less interested in whether they have this degree from the University of Illinois or Urbana-Champaign or anywhere else. And the fifth reality is what Holly was telling us, that there's a need for continuous reskilling and upskilling of the workforce, which will increase the demand for programs that are closely aligned with the labor market and provide certificates, microcredentials, and badges that have value beyond the traditional degree. So I think that those realities are driving the changes that many of our institutions are contemplating with respect to different types of programs, different types of credentials. But I think there are also financial realities. So the number of students entering university directly from high school in many parts of the nation is constricting and will continue to do so. While we have constriction in the traditional student base, the demand for non-traditional programs is growing substantially, perhaps exponentially. Adult learners are actively seeking to access personalized learning and are more than willing to contribute to the cost of these educational opportunities, which they view as investing in their future. Universities that can expand their reach and impact and achieve excellence at scale while maintaining their core mission can reap substantial financial rewards. And, kind of as an aside to this, I would say that when I started as a graduate dean about 7 years ago now, one of our biggest challenges at Illinois was developing a sustainable financial model for funding graduate education. Since that time, we've more than doubled the number of professional master's degrees at our institution. We've substantially increased our online degrees and certificates, and the revenue from those programs are being reinvested into PhD programs, being reinvested into faculty research. And that is a not insignificant benefit of some of these changes that we are undergoing. So the way we think of this at Illinois is that we have an opportunity to build synergistic collaborations between traditional and non-traditional providers of education. We have an opportunity to provide unprecedented access to affordable education across the life course. We have an IMBA degree with more than 3,000 students earning an MBA degree from the University of Illinois for less than $22,000 sticker price. That's providing access at scale. We have an opportunity to engage with employers, industry leaders, and entrepreneurs to figure out what we need to do. And we have a responsibility to harness our extraordinary research and innovation resources to lead and inspire others in this area. And I think that that's true for many of our institutions around the country. So how have we done this at Illinois? We've established 3 university-wide working groups. The first one takes a look at non-traditional programs, whether they're certificates, credentials, online professional degrees. We are assessing our current offerings and successes, and we're evaluating at a campus level opportunities for growth in terms of new programs and in terms of reach and scale. We have another working group on partnerships. We realize that Illinois can't make this transition on their own, and we're thinking about who we need to partner with within our institution, partner with other educational institutions, for example, state universities across the state of Illinois, and with non-education partners to figure out how to do this most effectively. And the third working group we have is focused on innovative learning environments. We recognize that transforming education into different types of programs, different types of credentials and delivery modes will require us to pay close attention to pedagogy and how we present educational and training environments for learners. So we are actively exploring ways in which our university will lead in advancing new approaches and innovations for technology-enabled personalized learning and mentoring. So just some ideas of how this has impacted our institution. When I started at the University of Illinois, we had 10,000 graduate students. Today, we have 20,578 graduate students, so a doubling of the number of graduate students. We have more than 30 online programs. I'll give you a few more numbers on the online and non-traditional programs in just a little bit. But if you look at this chart here, these are the last 4 years data. The orange section are the growth of master's degree programs, up to 13,000 master's degree programs. The yellow line in the middle are online degree programs, and the gray bar at the top are students taking certificates, badges, and other non-degree credentials. Now, this is our campus data for the whole campus. And I wanted to point out that this change is not ubiquitous and is not occurring everywhere on our campus. These are data for our biggest college, liberal arts and sciences, and you can see that they look pretty traditional. They look actually like a graduate graduate education image from 30 years ago. They have far more PhD students than they have master's degree students, and they have very little online programming. So one of our challenges is try to figure out how do we get this transformation to embrace broadly across all of our colleges and programs. So currently we offer 31 online degree programs, 10 campus graduate certificates. These are certificates that are approved by the Board of Higher Education and are eligible for federal and state student aid. We have 56 college level graduate certificates that don't appear on the transcript, but both campus graduate certificates and college graduate certificates are eligible to be stackable credentials. And I think that's similar to what Holly was talking about, incremental credentials. People at Illinois are now developing certificates that can both stand alone as evidence that a person has mastered some learning outcomes, but also can be stacked on top of one another to provide a new and different on-ramp to a degree if students should want to do this. So I won't go through all of these, but I just wanted to point out that we're certainly on our way, but we have a long way to go before we institutionalize the idea that every college and every program potentially has a role to play in advancing micro-credentials and other transformed education metrics. Just a couple more slides. I want to point out that the people who take these programs are different from our traditional on-campus programs. So our online students are older. They're more likely to be from a US underrepresented minority group. It's hard to convince people of color to come to a cornfield in the middle of Illinois, but if they can get an Illinois education online at an affordable price, they're more likely to do so. And then interestingly, our online programs are more likely to be domestic than they are our on-campus programs. So our graduate programs at Illinois are 50% and more international, but only 20% of our online programs are international. There's two ways to look at that. It's an opportunity to us to focus on recruiting domestic students, but it's also an opportunity for us to think about marketing some of our non-traditional programs more internationally. So I think I'll stop there. Let me just say in summary that we view micro-credentials, badges, stackable certificates, and different ways of accessing degree programs as part of the transformation of higher education. And we think that we will be a very different looking institution 10 years from now than we are today. I'll stop there, and I look forward to the conversation we're going to have a little bit later.
Thank you, Wojtek. That was a fantastic presentation. I learned so much. Julie, you are our final presenter.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to share my screen with you. Hopefully you can see it now. I really appreciate what Holly and Wojtek had to say. I was taking notes fast and furiously, and I'm really glad that those slides and that book reference will be shared with us. So we've been doing micro-credentials, graduate certificates primarily at MSU for some time. We currently offer about 100 graduate certificates, but that changes. You can see my comment. Every time I do this talk, I have to ask my staff what the number is because they do keep changing. One of the things that Holly mentioned, and I think Voitech too, is that it's really nice to have the certificates as a map, if you will, as well as a milestone in completing something. So I have a little picture here on this slide. This is the conferral ceremony for a group of students that we had at a partner university in Brazil. And they ended up finishing a degree, but they were very interested in us being able to confer this credential along the way. So that's a very powerful tool. At MSU, graduate certificates are transcripted and they are recognized as a credential just as the degree is recognized. And that's important for our state performance measure. So it's good for the university as well as being good for the students if they are recognized as an award. Most of the students currently are degree seeking and the degrees subsume the graduate certificates, but boy, I'm trying to learn a lot from what I heard from my colleagues about. We really, really want to get this going, and we have similar work groups to what Voitech described about how we can be out in the community and how we can do a better job of marketing our graduate certificates to students who aren't in degree programs. Our system for development is curricular. Approval is required. The nice thing about that, again, is it's transcripted. The trade-off is that anytime a formal curricular process is involved, it takes a year to get through it. MSU sets our minimum credit hours for a graduate certificate at 9. Usually that's 3 courses. What I tend to do is I have a graduate certificate called individualized studies, and I use that a lot for proof of concept and to avoid delay. So if we have a group of faculty or a partner who's interested in a particular focus area for a graduate certificate, and we don't offer that graduate certificate, we can bundle existing courses, put them under this individualized study umbrella, and still gets transcripted. It gets also mentioned, the focus area gets mentioned on the transcript, and it's a way to ensure that we're going to have a market by the time we go and actually establish that credential. Faculty, in a perfect world, faculty initiate and work with employers. Sometimes they do that. A great example of something that's worked here at MSU is that our faculty in healthcare administration have worked with our local hospitals to develop a credential, a graduate certificate model of delivery that works for their staff, primarily physicians. And indeed, what we find with that is a large majority of the docs are going on once they get the certificate, they want to go on and finish the master's degree as well. Employers sometimes reach out to us, they share a need, and we work jointly to develop a program. So I mentioned a successful one about the healthcare administration. I've had some unsuccessful stories. Sometimes employers will reach out, share a very clear need, offer to give us some support, but I just can't get the faculty behind it. And obviously that's a necessary thing to do. I think I'm going to get that book that Voitech talked about and give it to every faculty member on campus, because it really is very important for us to recognize this changing landscape. Those data that Holly shared, very important for us. So this is not only the best thing for our current and existing students, it's the best thing for our state, it's the best thing for our university to be able to quickly, nimbly offer these kinds of opportunities. We encourage the use of assessment of prior learning, if possible, and transfer from non-academic units. Of course, there are accreditor considerations in doing this, but let me give you 2 examples that have been successful. The first is Fort Leonard Wood, is Army base near us. We've worked closely with them, and they have the captain's officer training in chemical warfare. And so we offer a graduate certificate in countering weapons of mass destruction. So it worked out very well for us to be able to do a crosswalk between the knowledge and skills that the captains acquired through the Fort Leonard Wood officer training and the knowledge and skills they would have acquired through our courses. And again, it's pretty tedious work on the front end, But in the end, we were able to offer them coursework credit and actually this certificate for the work that they were doing at Fort Leonard Wood. Another example is our College of Education is using professional development opportunities in K through 12 teachers, and again, doing that careful crosswalk to make sure that it aligns with existing courses. In those cases where it doesn't align with an existing course, then they are using creatively assessment of prior learning to warrant credit in something like directed readings, etc. This is probably my favorite thing about what we are doing with our graduate credentials. So per university policy, admission to a graduate certificate only requires an undergraduate degree. We have no minimum GPA for our graduate certificate admission. So we see a lot of students who may have completed their undergraduate degree years ago, and obviously they're different people. And so rather than having to go through an exception request, a lot of times GPDs are they're more comfortable allowing students to be given entry admission to a graduate certificate. That's where they can prove themselves, and then they can matriculate onto a degree. So as I said, again, it's nice. I try to get all of our graduate certificate folks to consider this, but if there are some who aren't quite comfortable, I have a go-to option. I have that graduate certificate individualized studies and others that we can admit students to. They can work with advisors both in my unit because we oversee individualized graduate programs. And then we work closely with the potential graduate program director where the student might want to matriculate. Another example is because it's a credential, the students are eligible for financial aid. So that's a really important benefit over simply being considered a non-degree seeking student. So here's a great picture of my staff and I are working with the football coaches. This is all our football coaching staff at MSU, because they had several with the transfer portal rules changing. We had several athletes who were interested in transferring to Missouri State as a graduate student to play, but they didn't have the undergraduate GPA to warrant admission to a full degree program. And candidly, some of them had no intention of completing the full degree. They wanted to be here the 2 semesters in order to play, and then they were probably going to move on. So this certificate allows them to be monitored, have an advisor in the content area, and actually complete something from us prior to them moving on. Another great story is I had a kid who started with us, came in to play football. Football thing didn't work out so well here, but he completed 3 courses during spring training, during the fall semester, did an excellent job, transferred to another institution to play football to complete his eligibility. We've remained in touch, and I just got an email from him yesterday. He's transferring back some of the coursework he's earned at his present institution, and now he's going to earn a graduate credential from MSU that will recognize his academic efforts here in addition to his athletics. So those are some nuts and bolts ways that we handle micro-credentials at MSU. I will turn it back over to you.
Thanks so much, Julie. We can bring the panel back, and we're going to answer some audience questions now and do our roundtable for our remaining time. So the first question that we have kind of falls into our introductory comments, which was navigating the microcredential marketplace can be a challenge. We've seen it's very fast moving. How do you at your institutions, Wojtek and Julie, promote transparency when there's so much rapid change?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I think that what we want to do is preserve the integrity of our brand as a major research university and a major graduate program. And so we want to make sure that the credentials we offer are taught by our faculty at the same level of quality as any other courses that we offer at the institution. So I think it's a huge mistake to hire in people who don't have the same credentials to deliver micro-credentials. Rather, what you want to do is work on convincing your faculty that this is actually a valued and valuable extension of the role of the university and the faculty, and that way to build the credibility of your credentials.
I would echo that. I think that's probably what's going to make a difference in the university offering these credentials versus non-academic entities offering these credentials. As I said, ours are governed by all other rules that apply to any graduate degree. So in order to teach at the graduate level, you have to meet credential requirements to be graduate faculty. They have to go through the approval process. They're approved by the state, et cetera. So those same kinds of rigorous mechanisms that are put in place to ensure all quality hold true for our graduate certificates.
Thank you. So we've got a great question here from Jenny Phelps for Holly, which is a question that I always think about too. Do you know any campuses that are using graduate certificates as a way for enrolled PhD students to gain a particular specialization or skill set, almost like a minor, outside of their primary program of study? And if so, do you know how those programs are handling the cost question?
Well, I was on a panel actually a few months ago with a group of graduate schools, primarily in the sciences, biochemistry and others. And I learned that there is a fair amount of badging going on, to particularly in doctoral programs and in some of the master's programs, to demonstrate particular skills that graduates have that employers, some of the big labs, want them to have. How they're financing it, I'm not actually sure, but I think we could follow up and get some answers to that. But I was actually surprised that there was as much development as I heard from some of the campuses that were describing their efforts.
Any Wojtek or Julie, have you heard of any campuses? Are your campuses interested in this?
Yeah, this is a hot topic on our campus, and really what it comes down to, at least at the PhD level, is what your waiver applies to. Does it apply to courses towards your degree, or does it apply to whatever you want to do academically at the institution? And we are frankly struggling with that question right now, because you may have a student in one college getting a waiver for anything to do with their degree, but let's say they want to take a certificate or a minor in computer science in a different college. That costs money to deliver. And if you waive the tuition associated with that, how do you account for that? And I think we don't have an answer for that yet, but we are aware that we need to develop an answer, and we're kind of working on it.
Yeah, we handle things a similar way. We have a limit on the number of semesters that we allow students to hold assistantships. And then that number is actually increased. If you are seeking a second credential, such as if you're seeking a graduate certificate, it's increased by a semester. You're seeking another degree, it's increased by a little bit more. But what I don't have the staff to do this. We don't ensure that every course that's covered by the tuition fee waiver is applicable for the degree versus a certificate. We talk to the students, we talk to their advisors that we're counting on them to do it. But it is a challenge.
And I would just add that some of the universities in other nations are calling these things badges because certificates have a somewhat different definition in their qualifications framework. So that goes back to that cartoon I tried to show of what do we name these things, and there are a lot of synonyms. So I see mostly in the chat that certificate seems to be the predominant name, but we should all recognize that increasingly there's going to be other names for these things.
So we got a bunch of questions about financial support. So I'm going to try to condense. Heidi, our BC Kelm, I think, does a great job of kind of summarizing these questions. Is there any funding available to your certificate-seeking students, or are they exclusively self-funded? And then do you know of any policies which allow for the funding of micro-credential seekers or prohibits it? And we can start with Wojtek.
Yeah, I would say we are exploring, like many universities, I think our funding for graduate students historically has prioritized the PhD student. And we have much more money available to fund fellowships for doctoral students than we have master's students. We're exploring that and thinking about that heavily. You know, we do have some support for master's degree students. We can provide scholarships for students in self-supporting degree programs. The degree to which we should equalize or at least balance our support at the master's degree level versus the PhD level is an ongoing question for us. So I'd say we're very interested in thinking about this. Of course, with limited resources, it's not going to be easy, but I do think that there is a responsibility for us to think about making sure that people who experience financial hardship can access these programs in much the same way as all of our institutions do at the undergraduate level by providing financial incentives and financial support.
Julie, what about you? Same question.
So our funding for graduate students is really disseminated. It's distributed. So if a unit wants to fund the stipend, then my office covers the tuition fee waiver, but every unit has an allocation of tuition fee waivers. So they may be less inclined to give up one of those for a student seeking the certificate as opposed to a student seeking a degree. But we do. The institution also provides financial aid, access to financial aid for certificate seekers.
A question for Holly. For international students, we saw in Wojtek's slides that there seems to be less interest among international students in these types of credentials. Are international students eligible for visas for credit-bearing certificate programs? And are you generally seeing international students being less interested in micro-credential programs than domestic students?
No, I don't think I can answer that question because most of my exploration has been what is happening in universities in other nations to serve the students who are in those nations. So it may be that others could speak to that question.
We've had that a lot. As I mentioned earlier, we don't have international students coming to us simply for the purpose of earning a graduate certificate and letting that be it. Because that's a lot of time and expense, et cetera. But we do have partner, particularly dual degrees, where students will come to us. We take cohorts for a limited amount of time. They can't afford, perhaps, to come for the entire degree. So working with our partner, they provide part, we provide part, and our part is often done. It's often completable in 2 semesters. And during that 2 semesters, they're able to earn a graduate credential. I do want to circle back to the terminology that Holly mentioned, though. This is another thing that we really ran into with our international partners. When they think about certificates, you know, I can print a certificate right now on my computer and say, congratulations, everybody, for attending this webinar. And a lot of times that's the notion of what a certificate means. So we've had to really be careful to talk about this is a transcripted credential. And maybe something like a micro-credential or a badge might be more helpful, but that's very different. And sometimes our partners kind of scratch their head as, well, why do I have to engage in X number of hours of instructional time as opposed to just a day-long seminar? Because I get that piece of paper. So that terminology is really important. But we found those intermediate awarding of certificates to be very helpful with our international partners.
And I believe Credential Engine has identified 4 different types of credentials, of certificates, sorry, in their database. So just adding to what you just said, Julie.
You know, about the issue about visas, you know, I know that we can issue an I-20 for students who are coming in for a year-long intensive English course that ends up in a certificate. The challenge, I think, is that those students are not eligible for OPT or CPT or other kind of practical training. That oftentimes is a very significant reason why international students consider coming to the United States. So I think that the beauty of having stackable certificates is if a student comes on campus for a certificate that then leads to entry into a degree program, then they can stay to pursue some of the employment opportunities that they would be eligible for under a student visa.
So, Wojtek, I'm glad you mentioned stackables because we got a great question from Janelle Taylor here. What is the shelf life for a certificate to be used as part of a degree? If someone finishes a certificate and 10 years later, they want to use that towards a master's, is that acceptable? And then are there any national standards or rules to enforce any sorts of standards with stackable credentials?
I think anybody who applies from 10 years ago is going to be considered on a case-by-case basis, and it wouldn't be a purely central campus decision. It would be a decision that would be driven primarily for us by the faculty in the academic program to which the student was applying to. I wouldn't like to say no, and I wouldn't like to guarantee yes. I think it would be a depends question.
And I've got another question, this one for Julie. Julie, you mentioned a little bit that there's been some challenges with getting faculty buy-in around some of these micro-credentials. What are some of the tactics and strategies you've used to try to get faculty buy-in for these sorts of programs?
Well, I didn't say I was successful. I said that it's challenging. I think, the sooner that we can involve faculty in these discussions, I think having central administration, the president's office, the provost's office, the board talking about the importance of the university being involved in these spaces can be helpful. What works with a lot of our faculty is the notion of what this means for the individual student. Mm-hmm. So if we can provide a wade in the water, if you will, they can step in slowly without making a whole commitment to a degree. That may be a way to build confidence in students, to let them see that they can do it both from a personally, professionally, financially standpoint, and then maybe they'll be more likely to continue in this way. So I think appealing to how this is good for the student as well as good for the university, good for the state, has been successful. Obviously, they have to have the passion for the content. Like we're not going to be offering any graduate credentials in engineering because we don't do engineering here. So it has to be areas that you're already feeling good about and are able to offer.
Mm-hmm. Wojtek, you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, and maybe just one thing. I think that we are going to transition at our institution from a three-legged stool to a four-legged one over the next 10 or so years. And what I mean by that is I think every program at the University of Illinois recognizes it has a responsibility in the bachelor's, master's, and doctoral degree area. And I think 10 years from now, every program should recognize that it has a role to play in non-traditional programs that are delivered to different kinds of students, often different ways and often in non-degrees. We are a long way from every program recognizing that that's an intrinsic part of their educational mission. But I think that's where we're heading, and figuring out ways to bring the faculty along with us for that ride is a big challenge, and I think one that lots of people are thinking about.
Once again, the idea, I was just going to add, if you have existing degrees that allow a lot of flexibility and you can use those as proof of concept, no long-term commitment training grounds, that helps. We had a faculty member who got really nice grant to equip teachers in TESOL, and then she added some literacy. Well, really just taking those two there were existing certificates, putting those together. Then we have something called the Masters of Science in Interdisciplinary Studies. All we needed was to add a capstone experience, a research experience, and they had a degree. So using something that exists that allows a lot of flexibility might make it easier for you to get into how you combine things.
Well, I wanted to thank Julie, Wojtek, and Holly for fantastic presentations. I know that I learned so much. We will be sharing the slides, which include Holly's great list of resources, as well as Wojtek's book, which seems to be a really big hit in the
not my
in the
book,
chat.
not my book.
Your recommendation. I was trying to give you credit for it. But thank you, all three of you, for your fantastic presentation. And I just wanted to close with a couple of upcoming events. So we do have the upcoming CGS Summer Workshop in New Dean's Institute at the Hyatt Regency in Minneapolis from July 9th through 13th. The registration is still open. We'd love to see you there. We also have an upcoming sponsored webinar, Using Technology to Gain Insight into Your Graduate Students and Programs. Leaders Share Best Practices. And that's sponsored by Cayuse. And will be taking place on May 25th from 1 to 1:45 p.m. And registration is open for that as well. So if you can register through the CGS website. Thank you to the audience for joining today. And thank you to the presenters for your great presentations. We hope you have a great day, and we look forward to seeing you at a future webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.